The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been working on an initiative called Engineering with Nature. It all started in 2010. And this is the EWN Podcast. EWN is developing and implementing nature-based solutions for water and infrastructure projects. It's bringing together a growing international community of scientists, engineers, and researchers from all kinds of disciplines that are committed to harnessing the power of nature to solve problems. The EWN Podcast tells their stories. Now here's your host, Sarah Thorne of Decision Partners.
Extreme storms and rising sea levels are putting America's coastal national parks at high risk. How best to conserve and preserve the unique landscapes and important cultural heritage of these natural treasures was the challenge facing our guests. They, along with their colleagues and collaborators, are working with nature and incorporating innovative nature-based solutions to combat the significant effects of climate change. Welcome to Season 8, Episode 3. I am really happy to be here with my co-host, Amanda Tritinger, Deputy Lead of the Engineering with Nature program. Amanda, this is our first show together in Season 8. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me back. Sarah, happy Season 8. It's great to be here. I'm so excited to be here on the EWN podcast again, and I am more than excited about our guests here today.
I am too. Today, we're joined by two guests, Brian Davis, who's an associate professor of landscape architecture at the University of Virginia, and Cathy Johnson, who's a coastal ecologist and the Ocean and Coastal Resource Program Coordinator for the Northeast region of the National Park Service. Welcome to both of you. Let me start with Brian. Brian, you joined us way back in Season 2, Episode 2, when we talked about expanding the practice of engineering with nature through landscape architecture. You and your colleagues, Rob Holmes and Sean Burkholder, were the first landscape architects on the podcast, and we've had a lot since then. Brian, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Sarah and Amanda. It's great to join you all today and have a chance to talk with my colleague and collaborator, Cathy Johnson, about a project that we're really excited about. Good to join you.
It's great to have you back, Brian. And for those who don't know, fun fact about Brian, he's a member of the Dredge Research Collaborative. This group is pushing the boundaries of sustainable dredging and sediment management. And of recently, they have published a stunning book called Silt, Sand, Slurry, Dredging, Sediment, and the Worlds We Are Making. It's a really beautiful book, and it is a page-turner for anyone who's into sediment. Who knew? And Brian himself has contributed to this book. So please, if you can, there is an online version. You can take a look. But more than that, he's made huge strides with his work on projects in Galveston and New Jersey, just to highlight a few. And we're about to hear a few more. So impressive portfolio, Brian. Glad to have you.
Thank you very much.
Brian does amazing work, and I have to make sure that I look at the book because you guys have really turned me on to all the magic things that can be done with sediment. So when we taped that episode with Brian and his colleagues back then, I thought what they did was just totally cool. And I decided that if I had it to do all over again, I would love to be a landscape architect. And I think, Brian, you said to me at the time, well, you should do that. I think it's a bit late for that. And I really don't think I have your skills, but bless you. Let me bring on our second guest, Cathy Johnson. Cathy has worked with the National Park Service for 5 years, and she's really focused on developing nature-based solutions to help coastal parks adapt and respond to sea level rise. Cathy, we really want to learn more about your work. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, and I'm happy to be here. And I, too, would like to go back and be a landscape architect after having worked with Brian and his team for a while. It's just amazing stuff. The timing for this is really great from the National Park Service perspective too, because we've recently provided more clear guidance for the use of nature-based solutions to help us proactively respond to climate change. And there's a lot more interest from the parks and the public to expand that work.
Well, we want to dig into that. Before we do, Amanda and I want to talk to you about the projects you've been collaborating on for sure. We want to talk to you about that in a lot of detail. But before we do that, we want to hear a bit about your backgrounds, and we want to hear what you're really interested in.
Yeah, of course. We always want to hear what our guests are passionate about. So Brian, let's start with you. What's something that's really got you excited about right now? Whether it's a project you're working on, a new approach, or something it's just been inspiring you lately.
One of the things that really animates my work and that I'm most passionate about is the opportunity that's really being brought to the foreground by the emphasis on nature-based solutions to design for humans the things that we value in our everyday lives, the way we use public spaces and access coastal and riverine environments, build cities near them, and use them for important parts of our life, together with all the animals and plants that also love to be in these places. For a long time, a lot of design practices sort of saw those two things as separate, and you would do one via conservation and another via design. But one of the amazing things that's really happening through landscape architecture, engineering with nature, and the general emphasis on nature-based solutions is to unify those things. And so that's a through line through all of my work these days.
Well, and I think you're really translating that passion into your teaching as an associate professor at the University of Virginia. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely, Sarah. So when I started working with engineering with nature, I was actually a professor at Cornell University, which was another amazing opportunity, and I loved being there. But I ended up coming to the University of Virginia specifically because it afforded the opportunity to teach students that work, especially with graduate students, teaching them about landscape architectural theory and the technical practices and techniques needed for coastal design. The department here has an amazing tradition unifying sort of the design and protection of natural resources as well as public spaces. And so to be able to do that at the scale of infrastructure in the context of climate change was a charge that they offered me and which I couldn't turn down.
I think it's always really special when we're able to work on things that we're passionate about. I'm really excited to hear how you're able to incorporate nature-based solutions with your students and see that light bulb moment within them.
Yeah, that's right. When students come into our program, they're coming from all different backgrounds, which is a thing that we see as a strength, actually. So someone might be coming, they might have studied English as an undergrad, another person engineering or environmental science. They're all put into a design studio together and taught specific techniques and histories. And so even though they are learning a specific discipline, they're coming at it from wildly divergent perspectives, and the outcomes are equally diverse. And that's a real strength of the approach here. And one of the beautiful things about working with students that have those different perspectives, much different than my own.
Well, we're sure that you're inspiring your students, Brian, every day and in every studio that you're working in. Cathy, let's talk about you for a minute. Tell us a little bit about your background and tell us a little bit about what you do at the National Park Service.
Sure. So my primary role is to provide technical assistance to coastal parks or help them find the best available science to address a given management issue. And a lot of those issues are climate change related right now. Mm-hmm. A lot of times that means I connect them to researchers and experts on a given topic that I don't have expertise in, like Brian and his team. I'm an ecologist by training, so I spend most of my time focusing on natural resources like the marshes, beaches, dunes at the parks, and the plants and wildlife that live there. However, the resources that the Park Service stewards extends well beyond the natural environment. The Park Service is tasked with conserving and protecting both natural and cultural resources, while also providing opportunities for the public use and enjoyment of these areas. Since everything is intertwined in some way, natural and cultural resources, recreational opportunities, infrastructure, interpretive opportunities for visitors, I find myself spending a lot of time working on different types of things outside of my wheelhouse, so I'm always learning, and that is fun. I would say that the already challenging mandate that the Park Service has is made all the more complex by climate change, whether it's sea level rise causing changes to habitats and the species there, saltwater intrusion impacting wells or causing loss or degradation of archaeological resources, or increased storm surge impacts and flooding impacting buildings, roads, and other infrastructure along the coast. And so it's really exciting to be working on nature-based solutions with Brian here because they can play a role in addressing almost all of those issues.
Well, Cathy, it kind of sounds like you're the point where challenges become opportunities. And in fact, you're a pivot point in that way, dealing with these multidiscipline challenges and also multidiscipline personalities, I'm sure. Well, we told you already we're interested in passion. We've asked Brian, now it's your turn. What are you passionate about?
All right. I know this sounds hokey, but it's true. I really am passionate about the mission of the National Park Service. I feel so lucky to work here. To preserve the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. And it's the future generations part that really gets me. I feel like it's our responsibility, all of us, to leave a world a little bit better, or at least not worse, for future generations. And the idea that some of the amazing things that I'm lucky enough to see at the national parks and elsewhere might not be around for the children of the future to someday see is really heartbreaking. So I'm happy to do my small part to make a difference and hopefully contribute to positive change for my kids and other kids in the future.
Well, if that's a hokey reason, then I'm jumping on the hokey train because that is a good one.
It sounds like you're in the right place, Cathy, and you're doing the right kind of work. So let's talk about that work, because what you and Brian are doing together is just absolutely astonishing. You're doing this really collaborative work to incorporate nature-based solutions into coastal parks. And you're faced with a lot of challenges in terms of your mandate, your mission at the parks. Maybe you could talk about some of that context, Cathy, and then we could talk about the project specifically.
As I mentioned, the impacts of climate change are making park unit management to meet that NPS dual mandate, conserving natural resources and preserving cultural resources, much more complicated and difficult. That's both because of the broad-scale impacts that climate change has on our resources, especially along the coast, but also because of the unpredictability of future conditions. When the Park Service was established more than a century ago, folks assumed that environmental conditions were relatively stable and they'd probably go on that way well into the future. So meeting the mission of preserving unimpaired the natural and cultural resources made sense, and it seemed like a reasonable long-term mandate. But enter climate change and a lot of other broad-scale anthropogenic impacts. With changes in temperature, precipitation, sea level rise, storm events, and other factors, it's clear that the national parks will increasingly look and function differently in the future. As such, we have to better understand, plan for, and adapt to the challenges that climate change creates. And that means shifting our management paradigm to proactively manage where necessary to protect and restore the resources and values here. And nature-based solutions, again, is a great way to do that.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that to us and this sort of the state of the national parks and where they're at with adapting to climate change. I always find it really interesting to hear the history and the nuances of how we got where we are. That said, could you dive a little deeper and give us an example of what that changing landscape and that mandate looks like?
Sure. So one of the areas that we were working in is Colonial National Historic Park. We'll talk a little bit more about the park specifically later, but it has bluff areas that protect important archaeological resources, protect an important road system, but are also really close to the water. And with climate change, erosion on the bluffs has been exacerbated in a crazy way. And so you're not only losing the archaeological resources there, but it's coming really close to the roadways as well. So we can't just leave it alone. We can't just do nothing, or you're going to lose all the values of that park. So we have to do some kind of proactive management to get ahead of things and try to stop it before we lose those resources and values.
A complex challenge, like you said.
And really kind of speeded up by climate change, right? It's really the challenge has really been enhanced, but the imperative has also been ramped up with climate change and the loss of potential parks and the values that they bring.
Sarah and Amanda, you can see in Cathy's explanation, not only, well, she's not even really leaning into her subject matter expertise, but you can see her sort of comprehensive understanding of the role and meaning of national parks, and especially in a time of climate change. I should also mention she's expert at navigating the particular bureaucratic culture of the national parks, which has its own, unique opportunities. You can see in all of those qualities, one of the reasons that we were so excited to join with her as a team on this particular project.
So you two are obviously very good collaborators. You've been collaborating to address the challenges of sea level rise in some parks that are really of great natural and cultural significance. Brian, maybe you could start by talking a little bit about your work together on this big project, and then we'll, talk about some of the components.
Sure. 3 years ago, Cathy, myself, Jackie Specht, and Isaac Hammett, at that time both working at the Nature Conservancy, came together around this idea that we called, the title of the project is Preserving Coastal Parklands. The understanding was to focus on the national parks, specifically on the 88 coastal national park units out of 430 some that exist, and to identify a couple within the Northeast region. The idea was to bring together designers and scientists, as well as engineers and other subject matter experts that could work with the national parks in these different contexts, develop new nature-based solutions to the problems they were facing. And then I should also say part of the intention in pairing with members from TNC, the Nature Conservancy, was we thought that we might be able to understand things by working with the national parks that could matter for state, local, and county parks, places that maybe don't have access to people like Cathy or to some of the resources, but that if solutions could be developed, they could help to adopt them and implement them in order to improve communities way beyond the boundaries of the parks that we were able to work in. So that was the original impetus for the project, and essentially what we sort of sketched out when proposing it to the EWN program.
And Brian, can you speak a little bit about the desire and maybe the imperative to use nature-based solutions in these projects?
Yes, Sarah, that's a great question. So we felt as a team that the nature-based solutions would be one, or bringing this approach, specifically focus on nature-based solutions, would be a means of satisfying the double mandate, which is often seen as a real troubling aspect or difficult aspect of the national parks. That is, they have to conserve natural resources and preserve cultural resources. And these are often gotten at with very different means. But one of the original insights, or the basic insights, I should say, I don't know that it was original, but one of the basic insights that our team had was that nature-based solutions offered an opportunity to do both at the same time by understanding the nature of the landscape and using that nature, it's, the natural processes, forms, to achieve desirable goals, whether it's wetland restoration, protecting parkways and other roads, camping facilities, et cetera.
A lot of what the Park Service and other land managers have used in the past is hard structures, right? So you can meet some of your goals that way. You can put up a wall and try to protect a specific area. You can put out a jetty, but you're impacting the landscape adjacent to that area in a negative way. So how can we try to get the benefits, the protection from some of that, some sort of hybrid or natural infrastructure, while not having the same adverse impacts to the adjacent landscape? So nature-based solutions seems to lend itself to that a lot. And just kind of going back to the collaboration side of things, I just wanted to promote Brian and his team a little more at UVA. It's just been an amazing collaboration for me. He and his team, along with his landscape architect colleagues, are the creative minds behind the innovative NBS options we've been developing. They take the park issues and challenges that are presented through this project, and some input from the rest of us, and they develop and demonstrate how and where nature-based solutions can make the most sense. Sometimes I think things are a little crazy, like, oh, that's, what are you thinking? And then they present it in such a way and with these visualizations that it's like an aha moment, and it all makes sense to me. And I found myself starting to think very differently about the options available to us, and also how we can present those options to the public. So it's just been an amazing experience for me.
Cathy, give us an example of one of the big ahas for you.
Okay, well, we'll link to some of the documents because you really have to see the visualizations that they present as well. But it goes from everything from, hey, we're cutting trees for things over here. Instead of a wall, or at least for a short-term option, maybe we can use these trees as groins to slow the process while we figure out what else can happen there. So, using what's there available anyways, it's less of a permitting issue right up front, and it gives us time for things. That's very specific out to something very, very broad in terms of something like beneficial sediment use from dredge material that can apply to a much broader area and be much more of a longer term solution, and pretty much everything in between.
That's helpful. Thank you. Brian, you wanted to comment. I know you're blushing, but please comment.
Yeah, thanks. Well, one of the other reasons that I think nature-based solutions are really interesting for coastal parklands and the national parks is, one, we're working in a context where our society and the National Park Service specifically as the institution has decided that they are committed to the maintenance and to the maintenance of the values that are in that park, with the cultural and natural resources in perpetuity. So our society has made a commitment there. And the processes and values that are inherent to the place are what is valued. It's not some external thing, or it's not their potential for real estate development or what have you. The thing that's so amazing about nature-based solutions when working in that context is they work with natural forms and processes, so they can adapt over time, because you may accumulate sediment over time, for instance, or trees are always growing and then sometimes having to be cut down for safety issues or to open up views or to achieve a certain ecotype or ecological system that's desired in a specific region. And that produces materials that then have to be dealt with and can be used beneficially, for instance, for shoreline protection in other parts of the landscape. This is something that many societies may have done, hundreds of years ago, in some ways. And what we're trying to do is figure out how to do that now in a context of climate change and in the context of the national park system. Nature-based solutions allows us to work in a way that is reflective of that ongoing commitment that our society and the National Park Service has made to these landscapes, rather than just make a single one-time sort of solution and walk away. But nature-based solutions, because nature is so complex and so multivalent, it has so many forms, the variety of options open to the designers and land managers in these places is much broader than was originally imagined.
In the second part of our conversation, we talk about the 3 projects that Brian, Cathy, and their colleagues have been working on. Amanda kicks us off.
So it's clear you all are collaborating wonderfully as a team. I appreciate, Brian, you alluded a little bit earlier to Cathy's depth of knowledge and expertise in these many areas. And forgive me, but I have a bit of a background in music, so I'm building an analogy in my head where Cathy, you're the conductor here, and Brian, you're first chair LA, you're first chair landscape architect. Cathy, you are conducting a few different tunes. We've heard of 3 different projects now that you're working on with Brian. And could you just take a minute to tell us how these projects are each unique in their own way? What are their different rhythms? What are their stories that they hold?
Okay. These 3 parks were chosen not only because they're very different physiographically and ecologically, but also they have different historical and cultural contexts, and were created with a focus on different fundamental resources and values. And as a result, the emphasis and management of the parks differs. So Colonial National Historic Park in Virginia stretches from Yorktown to Jamestown Island and is connected by a 23-mile-long parkway and bounded by the York and James Rivers in the Chesapeake watershed. The park was established a long time ago in 1930 to preserve and interpret sites and stories central to the origin and establishment of the United States and evolution of American institutions, including the first permanent English settlement at Jamestown Island. And that's where our NBS project is focused there. So while the emphasis of this park is historical, Colonial also has abundant and diverse natural resources that are helping to protect a lot of these other resources. For example, there are extensive marshes there, and every time I go to the park, I see bald eagles, which breed there, and it's just awesome.
Wow, that does sound beautiful. Tell us a bit about Assateague Island.
Assateague Island National Seashore was established in 1965 and is part of a barrier island system that extends over 2 states, Virginia and Maryland. Assateague Island as a whole is owned and managed by 3 public agencies: the Park Service, the state of Maryland, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. The mission of the National Seashore is to preserve and protect the unique coastal resources and natural ecosystem conditions and processes there, and to provide high-quality resource-based recreational opportunities. Natural resources are front and center in the park's mission, and thus the focus of the management here is a lot different from that at Colonial.
And what about the last park?
The Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historic Park is the newest of the parks we're working on. It was created by Congress in 2014, and it's located on the eastern shore of Maryland. That park was established to preserve and interpret the historical, cultural, and natural resources associated with the life, work, and legacy of Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. The park landscape there is intertwined with the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge and the Maryland State Park, and both of those are legislative partners. So they are engaged in the management at the park, and the visitor center is co-managed with the state. Currently, the only property that the Park Service administers here is a 480-acre Jacob Jackson home site, and that's where our project was focused there. So you can see how they are all very different in their missions and their values and the resources that are important to them. And as a result, the things that they wanted to focus on and have NBS hopefully help with were very different as well.
That's a really good overview, Cathy. Thank you. Clearly, 3 very, very different parks and very different kinds of challenges. We don't have time to talk about them all in detail, but I think maybe if we could focus on one, Brian, maybe you could give us a bit of an overview of the nature-based solutions that you incorporated at Assateague Island National Seashore Park, since that project's almost complete and you've got a beautiful piece of work that we'll make sure we put on the Engineering Nature website to show us all your illustrations and your drawings.
Our team studied Assateague Island National Seashore for a year, actually for a little bit longer, as we were helping them refine some of the ideas and respond to comments. At that park, we had the opportunity to work with EA Science and Technology, and were supported by Kat Cerny-Chipman and Morgan Sims as we were developing some of the ideas, which was a really great collaboration. Mm-hmm. So one of the ideas, which a version of it has recently been implemented by the park staff there, was a temporary measure for the Bayside Peninsula, where they have some campgrounds and recreational facilities that's been eroding pretty quickly. And so there they wanted to stop erosion, but do so in a way that worked with natural processes. You heard in Cathy's description of Assateague Island that actually preserving unimpaired the natural processes is kind of part of their mandate. It's part of the enabling legislation, which is rare and pretty amazing. We wanted to develop something that could slow erosion and increase the habitat values and human use opportunities there at the park. Another thing that we were trying to do is simply document what they were already doing. The park team there, the refuge team, they work together, and the way they manage that island is really sophisticated and exceptional, we found from our experience. And so simply documenting it well so that others could draw from it, learn from it in terms of how they're managing the changes on the island and still enabling high quality habitat and recreational opportunities was one of the goals of the study. The temporary measures concept, essentially what it worked with was the idea of a rack line, which forms, where you get driftwood and other types of materials that are pushed up at high tides onto the backside of these peninsulas. And you would have had it especially historically, when a lot of our rivers and back bays would have had a lot more woody material in them before, contemporary or modern forest and landscape management practices were in place. So there, it was using the materials, sand and large logs, but arranging them in such a way that would slow waves or attenuate waves, slow erosion, and still allow access. Pedestrians to get down into the water there and look for terrapins or, go out on a kayak or something. So essentially, we arranged the logs into a kind of triangular shape and then backfilled those with sand that was being brought from the parking areas. Because the dunes are migrating into the parking lots and they have to constantly sort of clean those areas off. They're minimizing the wave attack on the existing shoreline. And then the sand that does erode out of those little cells that are created are contributing to the nearshore environment and helping build up wetlands in the adjacent areas. So we think that this is going to be something that is going to help reduce erosion and maintain the parking area there for the park visitors in the near term, while contributing sand to those back marshes, and does so within a context of the ongoing maintenance operations that are occurring within the park, daily.
It's a great example of just adaptive management. You're using what's there, you're using different nature-based solutions and adapting them to the situation that you're faced with, and they will continue to adapt. Can you talk a little bit about that part of it, Brian?
I can, and I can say that I think for us, a key in understanding how they might continue to adapt was we were understanding what people were already doing there. What were the practices and the materials, the equipment that they had to work with. And so we spent a lot of time with the Natural Resource Chief, Bill Hulslander, and also the Chief of Operations and Maintenance, Eric Sherry, learning from them and then understanding the sort of ingenuity that they were bringing to everyday problems. And all we were able to do was just give a little form and do some additional study about wave attack and future conditions to help kind of shape their ongoing practices. We think that this is something that can be ongoing because it's grounded in what they already do, that the migration of dunes into the parking areas is going to consistently provide sand. And even as the logs get displaced or rot, they'll just be contributing decaying woody material to the nearshore environment, which is a natural process, especially in the appropriate amounts. And it can be remade. They can remake these structures and features using equipment that they have on site and the ingenuity of the people that work that landscape every day. So in that particular case, that's why we think that concept will be sustainable at that park for a long time.
That's fantastic. And sticking with my music analogy here, it sounds like you are harmonizing the voices of many to come up with a multi-benefit solution that will adapt through time. And while respecting history, which is not only really important for that cultural anthropogenic need, but that is engineering with nature. That rack line was nature pointing out where this project needed to start. And that's just a really cool and smart way to go about doing innovative projects like this. I've been lucky enough to go to Assateague Island a few times, and I have to mention here that there's a feeling you get when you're there in that island, in that place where you feel like it's almost been untouched. It's more than the wild horses that you see running around. It's peaceful. The landscape makes sense. It feels almost raw in a way. You just sense this connection to something bigger. I just want to bring out how important that is and how impressive it is that you're bringing that into this project, that feeling of connection, connectivity to nature. And I'm just curious, with all of these challenges we're mentioning, how do you balance keeping that wild, natural vibe with this dredging work and these projects? How do you take these challenges and come up with a way to blend your sustainability with that kind of pure, unspoiled beauty?
Assateague Island National Seashore has been super proactive from the climate change perspective. more than most other parks. And their latest park management plan addresses the need to accept and adapt to climate change impacts as they affect the natural processes in this dynamic system. So getting to what you're talking about, Amanda, that balancing that, yep, our management plan talks about letting processes happen, and we need to do that. This is a dynamic environment, but we also need to protect those visitor resources that are also really important.
This gets to something that I think is at the heart of the future of our coastline in the country, and also the approach inherent, or one of the values inherent in nature-based solutions, and that's the issue of control. So for a long time, in my view, the way that we have approached designing with nature has been with an attitude of the need to control it, to make it kind of do what we want. And I think one of the things that we learned at ASATEAG and with all of our park partners in different ways, the thing that we're learning is the degree to which they respect and listen to the landscape and then try to work with that. And Cathy, you might, I know the Park Service works or has boiled down that ethos to a specific framework that y'all bring to these projects. The RAD framework.
Yeah.
They've been able to boil this ethos down to 3 words: resist, accept, and direct. And so the idea or the attitude is to figure out which one of those is most appropriate in a given landscape and to try to construe a project around that attitude. In the case of ASATEAG, because they're fundamentally trying to work with the natural processes, and the land managers there are really listening to the landscape while also trying to accommodate the millions of visitors like ourselves and our families that they receive every year. They are trying to not control the landscape and its processes, but to work with it to still get desirable outcomes. So let the sand migrate into let the dunes migrate into the parking areas and remove it as required so that people can still get there and bypass the sand essentially to the back of the island where it was going already. It's just a slight acceleration of a natural process in some ways. Even as that's happening, they're realizing, okay, well, the sand is moving too much, or it's too great a maintenance burden, and eventually it's going to be the beach where the parking area is. So one of the other ideas that they tasked us with and we looked at was, how do we manage these dunes? How do we think about the line of these dunes and in relationship to all of our recreational and road infrastructure?
So tell us about the creative solution you came up with for the dunes.
So we came up with a new idea that is another just extension of the way they're already working there. We called it the dune overwash zone. So they manage that dune system to allow for overwash in major events. And so we're coming up with a concept that allows for additional overwash, but by the placement of sand fences, maintains the sand volume within a transect of the island to minimize the potential for inlet formation or large-scale landscape change. And what this is meant to do by encouraging additional overwash is slowly build up platforms within the interior of the island that the dunes can migrate onto, and that they could have opportunities to move parking and roads around in the future, giving them additional flexibility in the long or in the medium term, we should say. So they're doing things in the short term, and they needed ways to adapt to the next 20 years. And guiding natural processes without fully controlling them was it's much more akin to like a dance than a concept of control. And that was something that we were able to sort of bring to life for them in that particular concept, the dune overwash zone.
Strong storms can change the landscape of the whole island by moving sand from the beach and dunes towards the interior and the back of the island. And this overwash process is super important to the ecology of the island, but it also impacts that infrastructure and the other resources that are important to the visitors. Management of the dunes can be an important element in minimizing those impacts, but it's also important to allow overwash in areas that are less likely to cause severe infrastructure impacts. So bird foraging habitat is important and needs that overwash. Sediment input to the marshes on the bayside is important and needs that overwash too. So having a flexible adaptive management approach, like what Brian and his team have developed to the dunes, allows the seashore to try and allow the natural processes to continue while also protecting those areas and infrastructure most important to the visitors.
we've talked a little bit about the acetate project. I want to understand what you learned. What are some of the key learnings and how you're incorporating the nature-based solutions that you put in place there, how you're incorporating that thinking into the collaborative work you're doing on the other projects, the Colonial National Historic Park project and the Harriet Tubman project. Brian, maybe you could kick us off.
I think one of the key lessons that we took away from Assateague was the value of being able to work with and listen to the people that are managing the landscape all the time. That's especially the park staff, but it also included other special interest groups, people that, go out there for particular reasons or have some stake in the future of the place and some ideas about it. That's an attitude or an insight that we've tried to bring to the other projects that we were working on. So at Harriet Tubman, that has been really, really invaluable. We worked with park staff there to identify a community advisory committee. This was folks, in addition to park staff and legislative partners, that have a real say and a real stake in what that landscape means and what it how it might matter to the community in the future. And so our work there has been not only doing the historical research, environmental modeling and analysis, and trying to come up with ideas, but also listening to the stories of those people and how they see it in their day-to-day life and how they imagine it for their family's future. Mm-hmm. And when I say they, I'm thinking of some of the indigenous tribes that live in the area, as well as descendant community of Harriet Tubman's family, but also just people that live in the county and appreciate the landscape in a lived and day-to-day way. So those were things that were on our mind. And fortunately on that project, we had a cultural anthropologist from the Nature Conservancy who was able to really take the lead, that has training in that specific stuff. All of that I was mentioning is sort of beyond Cathy and I's skill set. But Elizabeth Vandola from the Nature Conservancy was working with our team. She's one of the primary investigators and is leading those interactions and helping to add those as inputs into the design process itself, not just as sort of ways of getting feedback at the end to see if you get the okay or not. And that has been a really enriching thing that is in some ways just an extension of what we were learning from working with Assateague.
Mm. Cathy's nodding her head. Of course, our listeners can't see that.
I agree completely with Brian. So Colonial was our first project, and we were kind of learning how to work with the parks there. And then at Assateague, the engagement by all the staff and all the different kinds of programs, facilities, maintenance, cultural, interpretive, the leadership, everybody was really excited and engaged and wanted to kind of jump into this new concept. They were all about the creativity that can go into new, innovative ideas. So things went really well there, I think. And they will probably pursue a lot of those projects on their own after this is all said and done. And I also agree with Brian about Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historic Park. We also have great engagement there, not only by Deanna Mitchell, who's the superintendent there, who is just very excited about how this can connect to the story they're trying to tell there. Mm-hmm. But she's also really open to these new ideas. It's a very small landscape that we can work with there. The challenge for us there is to focus on Harriet Tubman's legacy, the time spent during her years working outside in the marshes, fields, and forests of the area, observing the stars in the natural environment, and developing those critical skills that would later help her escape and bring others to freedom. So it's trying to take that landscape with that interpretation while recognizing that landscape won't be here in 50 years, at least not in the form that it was when Harriet Tubman was here. How do we make that transition a smooth one? Facilitated marsh migration or other nature-based solutions, and having the engagement of the park and the descendant communities and the tribes in that process makes all the difference. They know so much more than we do about so many things I think that's the big lesson learned from both of those for me.
It's amazing how much information you can gain by just asking for that information.
Absolutely.
It's becoming really clear these 3 projects, each unique in their own way, with their own challenges, but their own, as you just brought to light, opportunities to talk and hear voices. I think what is being done by you, both Brian, Cathy, your team here, is you're building a framework for how to approach these issues with the solution of natural-based solution for achievement of the compromise of these multiple needs and then the outcome of multiple benefits. You are creating a framework that ideally could be picked up by others in similar situations. And there's a through line of scalability as well. So for each one of these projects, the region is different, the scale is different. And that is something that's really a key value of engineering with nature is the scale of the solution, the complexity of the solution needs to match the scale of the problem. And you need to do that step back, look at the macro scale, your geospatial variability, your temporal variability. And what I'm seeing is this team do that very well. And Sarah and I will, of course, add in the show notes links to these reports so everybody can jump on that scalability and that framework and figure out how to fit it to their own complex issues. I do have a tough question for the two of you now. Now that I've built you up, I'm going to throw this your way. How do you ensure that this innovative approach that you've developed to these very different complex solutions can be applied in different contexts while still addressing those larger challenges? Brian, you're first.
In some ways, this approach is more complex. It requires additional coordination. It requires time and scope built in for listening, not only studying the landscape itself, but identifying individuals and groups, representatives that can teach us those things. Because we could all go work in a given landscape and identify folks at random, and maybe the inputs or insights wouldn't be quite as valuable. And so that takes a lot of skill. For instance, working with a historian who we have on the team, Aaron Patalik, or a cultural anthropologist, all of those a little bit unusual in a nature-based solutions approach, and one of the really unique things about this work. And I think, honestly, the support of the Engineering with Nature program and the interest of the National Park Service has made that unorthodox and complex approach a little bit more possible. I think that the test of how to make this approach more widespread, the test is twofold. One, in my view, for the most part, nature-based solutions should be cheaper and better than conventional solutions. That's not always the case. If you're protecting a bridge abutment or a wastewater treatment plant or something, then of course that might be a different story. But if we're talking about large-scale habitat restoration or some of the dune management and such, nature-based solutions, they are adaptable, but not if they're only bolted on to conventional approaches that only increase cost. That just makes it a very bespoke and one-off approach that can only happen in communities of means. So in our approach, one of the things we're really aiming at are solutions that are achievable. That means they're affordable and there's real permitting pathways. And then nature-based solutions should be better. So they should still provide the required protection, even if not always in the exact same form. For instance, maybe the beach goes away a little bit before it builds back up in the summertime or what have you. But being able to still have what you described in your experience going to Assateague Island, where you experience the bigness, the wildness of the place, a landscape that is accessible to us, but is not under our control. And that there's something very important, almost like spiritually important about that. And being able to preserve those wild places and our access to them through nature-based solutions design, that seems like a real way to make them better and is a fundamental thing I think we need to achieve to be able to adapt this approach or adopt it at a wide scale.
Brilliant. Cathy, how about you?
Brian mentioned a few of the things that are usually my side of things. What are the sideboards? Reality check, kind of away from the creative side of things. But it's also really important because if things are too expensive, if they haven't been proven, it's difficult to get people to accept them as a new idea when they're so used to something else that they've had that's worked. Maybe this wall held up for a really long time and now it's going to be gone. And it's so much easier to just think, let's just rebuild the wall. But there are better ideas out there. So I think by doing things like this project where we're developing a lot of different ideas for a lot of different resources and then implementing them, that's the expensive and tough part, but also monitoring these things. We can do all sorts of modeling to project how well they'll do, but until we have them in place and we monitor them, we can't bring everybody over to the side where they're convinced completely by us. So I think that's super important. From the federal government standpoint, there's a lot of encouragement for nature-based solutions, and that will help things a lot too. So in the past, let's say 5-10 years, a lot of documents have come out and guidance and examples for land managers to use to implement nature-based solutions. At the Park Service, there's the Climate Change Response Strategy updated in 2023, the Resist, Accept, Direct framework that Brian was talking about. Sometimes you do have to resist for something for at least a short period of time for a given resource. Sometimes you can just accept what's going to happen. And sometimes you can help direct things to protect things for a longer period of time. There are a lot of other things coming out from the government that don't have as interesting names. They are policy memorandums or manual policies or other government-y type things, but they're super important because they essentially are telling us from the Department of Interior, from the Park Service, broad-scale government, that we are to incorporate principles of nature-based solutions into our policies, our plans, our guidance documents, agreements, and other instruments for management and co-stewardship. We must do this. So we have to at least try. Will it always work? Not necessarily, but then we'll learn from that and move forward.
I think that's great. And I think that, what you've both been talking about is you now have the policy, but you also have the climate change imperative to think differently, think more openly, think more creatively. To Brian's point, use the resources at hand and do things differently and better. You've got a lot of responsibility in the mandates that you have to conserve and protect the parks for future generations. And I know that that's critical responsibility for you, Cathy, and you take it, I think you take it pretty personally.
Absolutely.
Before we wrap up, and we do have to wrap up this conversation at some point, Amanda and I would like to hear about your call to action. Cathy, I'm going to give it to you. What would you say to our listeners?
I would say go out and visit your parks and the other natural places around you to better understand what's at risk from these climate change impacts and talk to other folks about it. Make sure your children and other young people that you interact with learn about climate change and what we can all do to help keep these resources around for the future. It is their future. If you can, volunteer on a coastal resilience or restoration project. We're always looking for volunteers. It'll give you a better perspective about how we can help to keep these resources available for years to come. And I guarantee you'll leave feeling happier about yourself and about the future.
There's a guarantee. Okay, Brian, how about you? What's your call to action?
Mine's related to Cathy's, of course. I think my call to action would be to not give in to pessimism. I think sometimes, especially studying climate change or sea level rise, or even working on nature-based solutions, the scale of the problem can seem a little daunting. And also things are changing, and that involves loss. We're losing some things that we really value. But just being out in these landscapes, meeting the people that work in them, the people that still come to them and visit them, and also understanding and being able to help propose ideas about preserving those values and understanding better what's possible and what might be possible in the future is fills me with optimism. I think it's incumbent on us that have the opportunity to work in this field to not give in to pessimism,
I like that, Brian. I am more than happy to have someone tell me to be optimistic nowadays. So
You need someone to tell you.
It's right. I think that's a great call. And I don't know about the listeners, but I'm reaching for my national parks passport at this moment. So thank you both for these inspiring calls to actions. I think getting out there and being optimistic is what we needed to hear. So thank you for sharing your songs and your stories with us today and inspiring us.
Cathy and Brian, thank you for sharing the incredible work that you're both doing to conserve and protect these very precious coastal parks. I think the work you're doing today is so important, but it's also so important for future generations, as you said, Cathy. And your work is invaluable. You're bringing so much creativity and so much passion to the work that you do every day. It shows, and I'm sure the parks will appreciate it. So, Cathy, it's been just a great pleasure to have you on the podcast with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Brian, we really appreciate you coming back and sharing what you're working on with Cathy to really advance the application of nature-based solutions in coastal parks. And your work is always fascinating to talk about, fascinating to hear about, and I hope you'll come back and join us again.
Anytime, Sarah.
Thank you both. I have learned so much, and I'm sorry to make this plug, but I'm also not sorry to make it. As a dune steward, I so appreciated your insights on overwash and how the dunes are so important to our ecosystem. Thank you. But moving forward, thanks for giving us an optimistic look on life and insight into the inner workings on scaling up and creating solutions that will help us as a nation to fight climate change and build a beautiful future. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. I look forward to co-hosting with you again sometime real soon. And to all of you, thank you so much for listening. We hope that you've enjoyed this podcast, and we hope you'll join us again as we talk about engineering with nature.
You've been listening to the EWN podcast, developed by Sarah Thorne and Jeff King, National Lead, Engineering with Nature Initiative, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now, for more information, you can visit our website, engineeringwithnature.org. The EWN podcast is produced by iContact Productions for the Engineering with Nature program within the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm Dave Trafford.